Welcome to Belief Busters Podcast, where we change the world one belief at a time. True transformation happens when we question if the beliefs we hold are of truth, or simply someone else's belief that we have internalized as our own. I'm your host, Rev. Cherie Taylor-Jones, and I'm glad you could join us on the journey. Today we have Andrew Ecker, author of The Sacred Seven. His ancestry is Apache, Irish, and German American. He was born into an inheritance of trauma. Both his parents were addicted to drugs and died very young. Growing up in the height of the Reagan and Clinton war on drugs policies led Andrew down a path of destruction that included cocaine and heroin abuse, until he made a decision to change his life while serving 3.5 years in federal prison for drug charges. Andrew found healing in his life through the use of ancient technologies, including drumming and a ceremonial introduction process of his Native American ancestry he outlines in his book, The Sacred Seven. Welcome, Andrew.
Oh, thank you so much, Reverend. I'm so grateful to be here with you and connecting to this time, and also all of the listeners here. And I would love to introduce myself to you in the traditional language as best as I can, and then also the contemporary. So dogate yinishe, donna e nishinigi e inde nishe, Irish bashachin, inde dashache, German dashanalia, kote go e tishli e Portland, Oregon inasha, shama e Kathy Lindsey woye, shaza e del Ecker wole. So I am Andrew Ecker, my mother, Kathy Lindsey, my father, Dale Ecker. My mother's mother, Elva Gallegos, Apache woman from New Mexico. My father's mother, Evelyn Beatty, Irish woman from Pennsylvania. My mother's father, Leroy Lindsey, Apache man from Arkansas. My father's father, Wayne Ecker, German Algonquin from Pennsylvania. I have a daughter, Bailey, a son, Peyton, beautiful, beloved fiance, Monica. I was incarnated into this body in the land of the Multnomah and the Clackamas in Portland, Oregon. Although I reside here in the land of the Akmal Atam, the Peepash, the Maricopa, the Inde people, here in the beautiful city of Phoenix, Arizona. And I am so grateful to be here to share with the audience the practice of identifying ourselves beyond behavior.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. That it's a very rich legacy that, as you're talking about it, it just translates energetically into this beautiful energy. So thank you for sharing that with us.
It's so beautiful that you're sensitive to that.
Oh,
That you really have the sensitivity to feel into that space, because that means that there's a level of spiritual maturity in you. And when I first encountered the ceremonial introduction, it was like I felt that as well. And that was what really brought me into the path of praying with it,
yeah.
Seeking it, really, resting into that space. What does that mean to introduce yourself in that way? And all those questions came up for me. So I'm very grateful to be able to share the introduction with you, and also start the process in that. Oftentimes people will say, well, what's the name of my mother's mother? What's the name of my father's mother? Do I know her maiden name? Do I know what land she was born in? Do I know where she came from? And that's important, right?
It is.
We have so many ways of getting kind of into the ego.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an author, I'm a speaker. In 2019, I facilitated 587 wellness programs. I've spoken in front of blah, blah, blah audience. And, I've worked for this government agency and everything. And, our ancestors knew, right? Humility. They knew, like, what does it feel like to be a child? And then why is there power in that child? What is that means to introduce myself as a child of, a grandchild of? What activation comes forward? The great teacher Jesus, he said, be like a child, he said. Have the faith of a child, that power inside. And there was a proclamation that Jesus said when he introduced himself in the synagogue that was very similar to this idea of self-identity. So many of our people out there are dying right now because they don't know that they're enough. They don't know who they are. They don't know that it's enough to be a child.
Yes.
That it's enough to be a grandchild.
Yes. And that's one of the reasons that I've brought you here for this discussion, because we forget that we have a lineage, and we forget that in that lineage there are issues, there's trauma, there's gifts, there's so much there. So I really wanted to talk to you about generational trauma, understanding our lineage, and then how do we now transcend, right? We want to include and transcend that lineage, that trauma, to have an abundant life. So super excited about this conversation because I've never had this conversation with anyone.
Mm. Oh, so powerful. And, you know, for me, what comes forward in that idea of generational trauma is when I introduce my mom, right? I'm introducing the person that used me to shoplift, you know, to support
Yeah.
her cocaine habit. You
Yeah.
know, I'm introducing my father that thought being a good dad was turning me onto a clean heroin connection.
Yeah.
That, you know, by the time I was a teenager, I was already using heroin with my own father, you know. And some people in this world, right, they're born with a silver spoon in their mouth. They
Hmm.
say, well, you know, me, I was born with a heroin spoon in my mouth. You know, that's the inheritance of trauma that I grew up with. You
Yes.
know, it was very challenging and a lot of violence. You know, those of us that are old enough to remember the Reagan era, you know, we remember what happened with our mental health and how it's just gone down ever since. You know,
Correct.
the reason that we're in this time of the greatest level of suicide, highest level of depression, highest level of drug addiction, more people incarcerated than any other time in the world, is
Right.
not because it happened overnight. You know, our families are still trying to put back together the crack cocaine epidemic. We're still trying to put back together the war on drugs, which was not a war on drugs. Let's not
Yeah.
fool ourselves. It
Correct.
was a war on people. It was a
Correct.
war on families. And I was one of those children that grew up when the DARE program was coming into the schools.
Hmm.
You know, and this was the Nancy Reagan Just Say No program.
Correct.
You know,
Yeah.
Dare was drug abuse resistance and education.
Right.
You
And let's
know,
also call it that it was a war on people of color and Native Indigenous people. Let's call it what it is.
it's very true. And it's very, very true. And the disproportionate amount of African American people and Native American people and Latino people and all the different colors of this beautiful country, it is very disproportionate in our federal prison system and in our state level prison systems. And that is the truth of the land. We
Yeah.
know this. You know, those of us, especially that have grown up in those neighborhoods, you know, I can tell you that the way that the police showed up knocking on my door in my brown family was different than the way they showed up knocking on my door in my white family. It
Yep.
was two different ways. They
Yep.
broke the door in my family, you know, my brown family in Portland, Oregon, because we were the only brown family in Portland, Oregon. We all transplanted from New Mexico there.
Yeah.
And we were the only people that spoke the language that we spoke. We were the only people that ate the foods that we ate. You know, it was a totally different environment.
Yeah.
And when they came late at night, they broke in my door. I was a little boy. They had guns drawn on me. They threw my mother to the ground. She was trying to say goodbye to me and my sister, and they beat her in front of us, you
Oh my
know. And
God.
this was a traumatic experience that I carried. I have a relationship with it still to this day,
Of course you do.
you know. And these sorts of things that we've lived through as a community, as a people, you know, when the DARE program came into my school and they looked at this group of elementary school kids, Reverend, and they said, if you have one drug addict parent, you're 50% more likely to become a drug addict. Now, let me tell you something about genetics, okay? Every genetic study goes back to eugenics, and eugenics is based in white supremacy. This
Yep.
is things that the people need to know this. This is the same sort of studies that were done by Hitler. These are the same sort of studies that gave ideas to the rise of genetic superiority. When you say this to a group of children, I didn't know, I wasn't the greatest mathematician in the world, but I sure knew what 50 and 50 was. Now, realize this, I'm also in a complete post traumatic stress experience because my mom has told me if they interrogate you, you need to tell them that we don't smoke marijuana because these were the tactics of the DARE
Right.
program. Armed police officers coming into our schools and interrogating children, getting them to turn parents in. And sadly, the DARE program's still around to this day.
Yep, it
You
is.
know, it's still around and it's being used by backwards communities that haven't realized that we're not going to solve these issues with war.
Right.
You know, the only way that we're going to solve these issues is by understanding one another, empathy. This is the power that this tool of ceremonial introduction gives us. You see, when I sit back into that place and I introduce myself as a child, there's a subconscious and conscious place inside of you that says, I'm a child too. He has a grandma. I have a grandma.
Right.
He has a grandpa. I have a grandpa. Okay, now we're together. We're equal.
Yeah.
You see, and that place of equality is where we begin to unpack the generational trauma. You know, when I introduce my mom, I am introducing a person that used me to steal. When I introduce my dad, I am introducing a person that thought that being a good dad was turning me on to a clean heroin connection. And also, this person that has come to grips with that has found the medicine in that space. And I'll share with you, with the audience, you know, I was a little bit late to come to this interview because I was out in the community working. We just got done doing a drum circle and sharing the principles of self-identity with a group of White Mountain and San Carlos Apaches, my people, you know, my people from the tribal nations of my ancestry, and also some Dene, some Navajo people. And I was a little bit late. And the reason that I was late wasn't because I was out in mischief. I was doing the work of God. You see, and you were so grateful to let me be here. You know, you were like, oh no, that's okay. That's okay. Because I found the medicine in that relationship. Now in a peer-based support model, which is really how we have always done it since the dawn of cultural identity. We've sat in circle together. We've talked amongst each other. We've come to a place where, guess what? Your pain is my pain.
Yep.
Your situation is my situation. And that empathy begins to grow. It begins to show itself as beauty. And this is how we begin to use the trauma.
Yep.
Rather than saying, oh, you know, I need to get over this. You know, how much pressure we put on each other and we put it on ourselves.
That's the
You know,
truth. That's the truth. So let me go back a little bit and let's talk
okay.
about some of the indoctrinated beliefs that you had growing up in your immediate family system.
Oh my goodness. You know, I can tell you that even in the dysfunction of my family, I was really never taught that I was going to be less than. In fact, I was told, you know, you don't have to go out and drink. You don't have to go out and drug. But when the DARE program told me that I was genetically flawed, I did become indoctrinated to that belief. I literally felt this weight fall on me. Now, if you complement that with the John Wayne movies, with the Clint Eastwood movies, with all the stereotypes of what it meant to be Apache,
Right.
that we're this destructive savage, that we're thieves, that we're, you know, the lowest of the low, you know, the drunk Indian, all
Right.
of these stereotypes came into my mind. And it was like, I accepted it, Reverend. You know, I accepted it. I started to believe that was me. And guess what? When you have a belief system and a pattern, that creates a density of energy that will in turn create a gravity. Next thing you know, the gravity is pulling in people that are like that. They're pulling in, you know, it's pulling in the representations in community, the people who are going to tell you that you're that, all of those things.
Right, because
And
what we're doing is we're talking about energy. And so whatever
yes,
energy that we believe we are is what we create and outpicture in our world around us. And we attract those like beings, those people who are resonating in those frequencies now become part of our circle.
fully. You know, I use the example of, remember when we were kids and they would take out the parachute, right? And they would put the balls in the parachute. We would
Oh,
all bounce it up and down like this. Some of us did it in our house with a blanket, you know. Kids would come over, we'd put the dolls in there, we put the little GI Joes in there and
I
throw them up in the
remember.
air, you know. Well, if we did that with, and we all were holding this blanket and we put a bowling ball into the middle of the blanket, right? And then we all dropped marbles.
Hmm.
You know, where would those marbles go? They would go to that bowling ball.
Right.
Now, think about this, people. Every time that we say, oh, that little boy over there, he doesn't have a father, he's going to probably be like so and so. You know, that little girl over there, her mom's hooked on cocaine. She's going to probably be like so and so. Guess what we're doing? We're fortifying that metaphysical architecture, the energetic architecture of that bowling ball that's sitting into the middle. Guess where those children are going to go? You're going to go to that energy. They're going to go to that fortified space. We have to create hope again. We need to get into that density of that bowling ball and extract the potential in it. You see, the density of that suffering is our potential for our greatest proclamation of love.
Yeah.
It is the greatest proclamation of love when we can go in there and we can show up with our vulnerability and we can say, guess what? My mom was a cocaine addict. My mom did die of an overdose. And I want to share with you in that suffering place, you don't have to go down that road.
Yes.
You don't have to be that in your life. And yeah, your mom was that way too. You know what? And we're in it together. You're not alone.
Yeah.
We're a family. In our native tradition, when you don't know how to introduce yourself and you don't have a grandma, you don't have a dad, it's not your responsibility. It's not that child's responsibility. It is the community's responsibility. You see, it's said that you are abandoned, not in the way of you've been shunned by the community, not in the way that you've been pushed aside by the community, but in the place of, oh my gosh, this person needs a dad. This person needs a grandpa. And there's a remnant of that in our relationships in our families. I don't know how many barbecues I've gone to and everybody's an uncle, huh? Everybody's related, huh? You see what I'm saying? And we know this inside of it's woven into the fabric of our DNA, but
Right.
yet the toxicity of the culture has created this distancing
Yeah.
inside of us. How is it that someone can step in? And then how beautiful is it if we could get back to this idea of sacred seven and that little girl is sitting there by the fire, by the campfire, or just sitting in circle. And she says, I'm the grandma of, and her grandma looks over at her.
Hmm.
How beautiful that is to think about what the grandma would feel, what
Right.
the little girl would feel, what that
Connection.
exchange would, connection.
Connection, and meaningful that they matter to each other. It's meaningful. How did you get on this process now to really shift and transform those old indoctrinated beliefs of society that wanted to tell you who you were? How did you then work through that?
It was a long time coming. I mean, I did 3.5 years in prison, and that was where, and this is 20 years ago. I got 22 years since I pulled the needle out of my arm and put down the crack pipe.
Woohoo.
It's been 22 years. Thank you. And I'll share with you, while I was in there, that was the first time I felt safe. Now, people are going to be like, what do you mean you felt safe around the prison gangs,
Yeah.
around the rapists, around the murderers? Well, guess what? Home insecurity is real, people. There are people out there right now that are living month to month with the stress of not knowing if they're going to get kicked out. And
Yep.
that stress leads to behaviors. You want to take that pain away so deeply, you're going to reach out for whatever's closest. And most of the time it's a bottle. Most of the time it's the pipe. Most of the time it's a needle. Because that's the only way we can take away that pain.
Mm-hmm.
And that home security kept me in a perpetual cycle of my post-traumatic stress. I was afraid all the time. I had it so bad that I would go to the bathroom on myself as a little boy. I mean, we're talking up until the 6th grade. I was so afraid. I was showing these behaviors to
Yeah.
people. I have a relationship with PTSD, with depression, with addiction, all of these things. I was in prison. I finally found safety. I started to read. I finally read a book cover to cover. I made it out of high school. I graduated high school without ever reading a book.
Holy.
I was just so smart that I could listen to what they were telling me and I would pass the test. I hardly ever even did any homework.
Wow.
I was just that intelligent. And when I was in prison, I finally found a way to start to read. I read a book called by Bo Lozoff that was set out by the Prison Ashram Society. And he described yoga, he described meditation, he described prayer. And from that book, I started to meditate, I started to pray, I started to do yoga. And then I reached out for what was directly in front of me, which was Christianity. And I went full on into Christianity. I had that jailhouse religion. And I mean, I had it big. When I got out, I went directly into the ministry. Now what has happened is I've created a self-identity around being a child of God.
Nice.
Okay. Now, inside of that self-identity, there was a lot of behaviors. I had to live up to this. I couldn't swear. I couldn't, drink. I couldn't go out and party. I had to live up to this idea. And for me, the perfection model, I was
Yeah.
rigid. I mean, we're talking about fasting, prayer. I fasted once a week. I prayed. I didn't swear. I showed up church on Wednesday. I stayed late on Sunday. I had a ministry. I was out knocking on doors in the ghetto, bringing kids into the church ministry. I would show up on the streets of Sunny Slope, which is a very drug infested neighborhood here in Phoenix.
Okay.
And I took the bus ministry from 3 kids to 2 buses filled with children. Hold a record at the church for the largest, holiday attendance. All these different things are happening to me in this time. Well, the creator had a plan right there, right?
Yep.
And this little boy comes on my bus, and here he is all raggedy, and he walks by me and he smells. And I turn around and I go and I follow him to the back of the bus. I sit there with him. Kids are picking on him. I tell the children, look ahead, don't
Yes.
look back at us. And they listen to me.
Okay.
And I sat there and I started ministering to this little boy. Is your mom in jail? He doesn't say anything. He just keeps his head down. Is your dad in jail? He just keeps his head down. I said, my mom was in jail. My dad was in prison. My mom had a drug problem. My dad had a drug problem. And I said, and I get, it just gets me like right here. I gotta hold myself for a second.
Sure.
I said, I used to go to the bathroom on myself. And just then he looks up and he's got these big crocodile tears
Oh
falling
my
down right here.
gosh.
And his face is so dirty that it's making like a little river of mud.
Oh, honey.
And it was like the Holy Spirit was bringing me myself,
Yes.
was bringing me myself.
Join us on the next episode of Belief Busters podcast for the conclusion of this conversation. If you are enjoying these conversations about assessing your belief systems and how to transform outdated beliefs, then please subscribe and give us a positive review. To support this podcast and its transformative work, you can also become a sponsor for as little as $5 a month. You can reach Rev Cherie at info@beliefbusterspodcast.org. To continue on this journey of evolution, you can also get my book, Turning Your Why into Why Not, at Amazon or any other bookstores, which gives you practical tools to do this work. See you next time on the flip side.